Hello, a very warm good morning to all of you and welcome to Unacademy. Welcome to today's The Hindu newspaper analysis, where we take a look at the Delhi edition of today's newspaper, analyze the articles relevant for your examination, make it crisp and understandable for your prelims as well as the mains exam. While we shall be discussing these articles and the important portions mentioned in today's newspaper, we shall also be analyzing the previous year question which have been raised from that particular topic, and along with that we shall also be taking a look at the practice questions in a way so that we improvise our answer writing skills. We are going to keep this discussion strictly apolitical and what is required for the syllabus, even if it means going beyond the phase of the article in itself, but whatever is required for you, whatever is understandable for you, that is something that we shall take up on priority. If you are liking this initiative of ours, please don't forget to click on the like, share and the subscribe button. Now, let us take a look into the topics that we are going to have a discussion for today. So today in total, we are going to have a discussion for 8 different topics. First of all, the editorial page, the 5 guidelines to a dragon elephant tango. And this is an article written by the Chinese ambassador to India. And he talks about the various nuances which should be kept in mind and the various principles which should be kept in mind in order to improve the Indo-China relations. This is something relevant for your GS paper 2. Then, an unstated shift in Modi's economic direction. This is again an article which has appeared in the editorial section, which talks about the employee or the employment linked incentive scheme which has been announced by the government in this year's budget. So why is it a departure from the previous economic directionality that the government took, and what can be the implications of this scheme? That is something being talked about. This is relevant for your GS paper 3. Then, the weakest first. This is again a brief analysis in the editorial section about the sub-quota judgment which the Supreme Court has arrived at, where it talked about that within the scheduled castes as well, you have to provide, or the states can have the provision to provide the sub-quota within them. So what are the implications of that? This is again relevant for your GS paper 2. Then after that, death reigns in Wayanad. The entire country is witnessing the horror unfolding itself in the region of Wayanad and other areas of Kerala, where the casualties, they are mounting day after day. And simultaneously, you have had significant amount of these landslide events happening almost simultaneously in the region of Himachal Pradesh, in the region of Uttarakhand, as well as in the region of West Bengal. So, why did this event unfold in Wayanad? We are going to take a look at the brief basics of it, and then we are going to move ahead with the aspect of what can be done going ahead in the future. So, this is relevant for your GS paper 1 as well as GS paper 3. Now, Centre reissues draft notification on environmentally sensitive areas or ecologically sensitive areas in Western Ghats. So this is again basically relevant for your GS paper 3. Then India faces dilemma amid rising Israel-Iran tensions after the assassination of the Hamas leader by Israel. So that is where India finds itself in a kind of a fix. So this is something again relevant for your GS 2. Couple of articles relevant for your prelims, that is India selects 2 crew missions for, or the 2 crew members for the Axiom 4 missions on International Space Station, and elevated broad-based food inflation to force RBI to hold its stance when it comes to the monetary policy. So these are the various topics that we are going to have a discussion for today. Starting with the first topic of the day, which has appeared in the editorial section of the newspaper, and that is the 5 guidelines to a dragon elephant tango. Now, this is relevant for your portion of international relations. Now here, this article, framed and written by the 17th Chinese ambassador to India, it talks about the similarities, the commonalities when it comes to China and India, and also the need for development and mutual understanding to be developed between them. Now, we all are aware that India and China and Indo-China relationships, they are not exactly going through the sweetest spots at the moment. Ever since the Galwan clash, there has been a significant amount of rift and significant amount of tensions which have existed. Various different border rounds of talks have not yielded the desired results. Now, recently, you basically had a meeting between India's External Affairs Minister S. Jaishankar and Chinese Wang Yi, the Foreign Minister of China. Now, there they agreed on the 5 mutual aspects that each of the countries have to respect with each other. Now, that is what these 5 mutual aspects are, around which the entire article is triggered around. So, let us understand what was the agreement, or what was the in principle agreement between S. Jaishankar and Wang Yi, and how that can pave a way forward for Indo-Chinese relationship. And we are also going to use this opportunity to understand the key challenges which confront Indo-China relationships. At the same time, we have to be appreciative of the key opportunities that both countries can actually utilize and move ahead together. So here, first of all, what were the 5 mutuals that both the External Affairs Minister or Foreign Ministers agreed upon? So they talked about the aspect of improvement of mutual trust, mutual understanding, mutual respect, mutual accommodation, as well as mutual accomplishment. Now, what are these? And that is what the article argues, that look, if we have to move ahead, before that, we have to understand that China and India are amongst the 2 largest developing economies and the 2 most major developing economies across the world. Now, generally, the perception for the last few years have been that both these countries are at loggerheads and they move in an opposite direction to each other. That is where the article argues that we need to respect these 5 mutuals and then we can move ahead together. What are these 5 mutuals? Mutual trust. So as of now, it is safe to assume that we have a significantly growing trust deficit between both these various countries. Now, trust deficit in terms of whenever India, let's suppose, hosts a foreign delegation from US or from Quad countries, immediately there is a sharp retort from China. And simultaneously, whenever, let's suppose, you have the case where the Chinese have a meeting with the Pakistani side, and the China-Pakistan axis is something that we have our own reservations against. So, this article argues that rather than having that suspicious attitude towards each other, both the neighbors should basically trust each other that we are not going to damage each other or damage each other's interest. Now, it is like a double-edged sword. Let's suppose you trust China for this factor, but simultaneously you observe that the Chinese actions, they speak something else. For example, even when Indo-China relationships, they were on a good footing, let's suppose almost 5 to 6 years back, at that point of time also, China was significantly and actively pursuing its goals of opening up naval bases all around the region of India. So that raises suspicions. So that mutual trust which is being advocated has got its own challenges in order to achieve that. Then mutual understanding. You see, when we talk about understanding each other's actions, we also have to understand each other's realities, in the sense that from Indian side, we have to understand that China has already arrived at the global scenario. For China right now, India is no longer a competition. Chinese economy has basically bludgeoned past India and is almost 5 to 6 times the size of Indian economy. When we talk about Chinese defense prowess, they are also not developing with a view of Indian defense requirements. Chinese defense establishments, they are developing themselves, eyeing US as a main challenger. So we have to understand each other's realities. At the same time, China has to understand that India requires for itself to uplift almost 1.4 billion people into better living standards, into better life conditions, and significant amount of millions of population India needs to uplift out of poverty. So once that understanding develops, that is when there will be a mutual respect. And that mutual respect has to stem from the fact that both these civilizations, when we talk about living civilizations across the world, there are not many civilizations which continue their traditional and customary beliefs over the period of millennia. China and India are the examples of such living civilizations, where the civilization in these lands have not only thrived for thousands of years. It is not simply a study of history, but how our society is today is a living embodiment of our cultural past. So that is where we are the two most important living and continuing civilizations on the face of planet Earth. Both of us, that is China and India, have our own belief systems, have our own respective understanding of our own requirements. That is why we need to respect each other's own beliefs, the social structure. Here, for example, when we talk about China, there is a significant amount of conception or preconceived notion in India and across the world as well, that the social structure in China is something which is not very good. While that might be held to be true, let's suppose that they are following a policy of command economy, let's suppose they have a centralized system, let's suppose they have an authoritarian regime, etc. But the article basically argues for you that that does not mean we should have a disdain or a mistrust between us. We need to respect each other's social customs, society, demography, traditions, and also the economy at scale. Then, mutual accommodation. Here, it talks about accommodation of interests. Accommodation of interests. In the sense that each other's interests should not be damaged. Each other's sensitivities should be kept in mind. And then mutual accomplishment. India is growing at a very rapid pace. China has already traversed that path. So, as both of these nations try to achieve each and every other goal, there has to be an appreciation, a deep understanding of what they have managed to accomplish. In the past decade, for example, the rate of increase of India's per capita income, the number of people that India has managed to pull out of poverty, not only in the past decade, but for the past couple of decades almost, that has been staggering. China pursued this policy and this particular achievement prior to that. Now India is following that path. So that is where each other's accomplishment, that needs to also be respected. So these are the 5 mutuals that have been talked about, that has been agreed at the foreign ministers' meet. But still, we don't see any kind of a green shoot in terms of improving relations. Both of these countries would do significantly well in a better relationship world. They can have the voice of the billions held together. So here, first of all, let us analyze what are the key challenges that Indo-China relationships they face today. Not going into the pages of history, but when we talk about today's condition and today's time, what are the various challenges? So when we talk about the challenges, one of the key challenge is the never-ending border dispute between the countries. Now, border dispute between the countries is quite old, and that has got its genesis from the fact of Chinese own understanding of when these border agreements were signed, and also their understanding of what their own border constitutes. Now that has created mistrust to the basic minimal level and has also resulted in a full-fledged war in 1962, which had an adversarial impact on India. But at the same time, these border disputes, they are continuing time and time again. At the time of Deng Xiaoping, now you had the significantly easier agreement achieved and an understanding more or less to be achieved between India and China, where the famous principle followed at that point of time was that, look, just because we have border disputes, let us keep that on the sidelines And maybe our generation is not wise enough to arrive at a conclusion for this border dispute or resolve this border dispute. Let us allow the future generation. Maybe the future generations are wiser. Maybe they have a greater amount of information. They will be able to resolve the border dispute between us. And in the meanwhile, let us develop other facets of our relationship. So, there was a significant amount of peace which followed that agreement between India and China. And after that, you had the 1993 peace accord, etc. So after that, there was a simmering down of tensions in the border. Now, all that started changing in the late 2000s. When you had the Chinese Armed Forces, the People Liberation Army of China, which slowly pursued the policy of salami slicing. What was that salami slicing policy? The salami slicing policy, which induced significant amount of mistrust in Indian defense establishment, was simply, as the literal translation of the name goes, let's suppose you have a territory like this. Now, initially the Chinese forces would come up till here. Now, in that case, a very small land area is grabbed, so you would not pay that much attention. After a couple of years, the Chinese forces, let's suppose, further inch 1 kilometer. So, by the repetition of this process, at the same time ensuring that none of these aggressions are so stark so as to raise alarm bells, the Chinese successfully have managed over the past to basically ingress through larger portions of India, particularly in the region of eastern Ladakh. Having said that, the red line was crossed when you had the June 2020 incident, when the Chinese intruded and Indians also retaliated, resulting in the very vicious Galwan clash, where both the sides lost numerous amount of soldiers. Ever since that point of time, India has stood firm in its stance that we cannot allow this to happen. Even if we pursue the older wise idea that the future generations will take care of the border dispute, in the meanwhile, that does not warrant that China will have the luxury of incursion and carrying out these ingresses on an annual basis and then saying that there is no border dispute. So border dispute is indeed a sticking point. That is the reason why these border round talks which are being held after the Galwan clash, while that has led to a slight de-escalation, but still the conditions are quite tensed at the border region. India is developing its infrastructure at a very rapid pace in the bordering areas, be it the tunnels, be it the roads, be it the passes, everything, the bridges, and the same is being done by the Chinese forces as well. Now, when India develops that infrastructure, it is looked at suspiciously from the Chinese side, and that triggers responses. And that response now riles up the national sentiment. So the border dispute is a key sticking point. Unless and until there is a reasonable agreement in the sense of mutual respect that has been talked about, or mutual understanding of each other's problems, mutual accommodation of each other's interest, that is when we are, till that point, we cannot foresee an end to this tensed situation. Then you also have the Pakistan-China axis. Now, Chinese arms, small ammunitions, they are regularly being caught and seized in areas around the northeastern states, in the regions across Jammu and Kashmir sector, where the Pakistani insurgents from the west, they intrude into India with a prime agenda of causing disharmony and as well as spreading mayhem in the Indian territory. Now, at the same time, when you find Chinese small arms, Chinese technical equipments with them, there is an increased suspicion and a rising suspicion that China is basically indirectly supporting instability to be created in India. Now, that is never good when you take a look at the long-term approach of developing relations between the two countries. So this is again a sticking point. Be it the defense equipments that Pakistan is being supplied to, the latest kind of submarines, the latest type of missile systems, the latest system of aircrafts which are being developed. Now that again creates that rising mistrust. Then on the economic front, you also have the massive trade deficit, which is simply unsustainable. While the trade figures between India and China have been observing a significant rise over the past decade and a half, at the same time, one cannot ignore the rising trade deficit. When we talk about Chinese imports to India, they have been rising. But at the same time, many sectors of Chinese economy, they are closed for Indian investment, including the sectors such as software, sectors such as agriculture. In both these areas, India has got a significant advantage. Now, that is where Indian exports have the potential to do significant good. But then, Chinese policy of closing those sectors and at the same time ensuring that their exports flood the Indian market almost to the verge of dumping their exports into India, that has widened the trade deficit. Various different rounds of talks between the finance and the commerce ministries, that has also not resolved the issue. While you had summit level meeting between Xi Jinping and Prime Minister Narendra Modi in the past, they talked about opening up the software sector in China, allowing Indian skilled professionals, Indian software prowess to come into China, but progress was not made. So that is still a sticking point. And then the China continues with its ever dangerous string of pearls strategy. Every other day you would hear about the news story of the Chinese vessels, the Chinese defense vessels mooring themselves or coming to the shore around Sri Lanka or Maldives or Pakistan and the entire region around. China is actively pursuing its strategy of developing multiple such naval bases and dual-use platforms across the region of India so as to, it appears like, encircling the Indian subcontinent, so that if push comes to shove, India's capabilities can be limited quite significantly. Now, even when we talk about mutual understanding or mutual trust or mutual accommodation, at the same time, multiple visits by the Chinese research vessels into the Indian Ocean, into the region of Bay of Bengal, that does not raise any kind of a hope. Because you have to understand, on the face of it, China will say and communicates to the world that these are simple research vessels which are carrying out oceanic researches and oceanic studies in the region of Bay of Bengal. But everybody knows that these research vessels, they are primarily carrying out the bathymetric studies of the ocean. Bathymetric study basically means understanding the ocean bottom, what is known as bathymetric study. Metric study. So there, what these research vessels do, let's suppose you consider the ocean. Underneath the ocean, the land is not flat. You have various different ocean relief features, from seamounts to ghats to canyons, etc. Now, if you want to run a very successful, let's suppose, submarine campaign, where you want to launch a nuclear submarine into Bay of Bengal and cause damage to India, now there you need to understand in greater detail what lies at the base of the ocean floor, so that you can operate smoothly. At the same time, these Chinese vessels, oftentimes, they are found to be studying the salinity conditions, the variations in the various different currents in the region of Bay of Bengal and Arabian Sea. All of that is targeted towards facilitating submarine operations in the region of Indian Ocean area. So that does not incite any particular kind of a trust on the Indian side. Indian side will always look at these Chinese actions with some significant amount of suspicion. So these are some of the key challenges. But does not mean the picture is all gloomy. There are some key opportunities as well. What are those? So amongst the key opportunities, both of them are rising economies. It is a different matter that China still calls itself a developing country. But in all fairness, China has actually arrived at the world stage when it comes to its overall economic prowess, and more so when it comes to the technological prowess and the technological advances that the Chinese have made. Now, both of them basically are the voices of the global south. The developing world, which includes a good chunk of more than 100 countries, they look at India and China as the leaders which can voice their opinion. And that is why both of them are looking at, or both of them, they appear to be as the voices of the global south. So here, if both these countries, they speak in unison, that is where the voice will carry a greater weight. Be it in terms of economic imbalances, be it in terms of slight partiality shown by the global funding agencies like the IMF or the World Bank, the biases indicated by the Western world in terms of how the developing countries are supposed to take their developmental path. In all these areas, India and China have their own experiences and their own struggles with which they can ensure that the life of the global south is much better. At the same time, when it comes to pressing issues like climate change, both India and China have a very large population, and the population is impacted by the issues of climate change. In the sense, when you have excessive rainfall in the region of the Himalayas, while you have landslides, etc., which impact the region of India, but at the same time, Yangtze gets flooded. The Yunnan province experiences landslides. Huanghe gets flooded. And eventually that results in significant amount of casualties, landslides, etc., even in China. So as much as India is being impacted by climate change, so is China. Now, both of these countries, they are facing the wrath of climate change as a consequence of what the developed countries have already done. And that is why both these countries have a shared belief that while we need to do something to combat climate change, at the same time, the accountability does lie at the doorstep of these developed countries. So that is where they can be a unified voice against climate change, which is not exactly the case now. It was the case up till around 2008, 2009, but after that, the Chinese, they started aligning themselves with the part of the developed world. Then sharing of experiences, mutual sharing of experiences. While India has got its rich experience of significant amount of cultural diversity and how to grow in the case of the diverse society, China holds the fort when it comes to very quick and rapid rise and growth of economy. So both these countries have something to learn from each other. India can learn from China how to push forward in terms of economic as well as technological prowess. As of now, the number of patents being filed from the Chinese territory are amongst the highest, and it has remained so for almost a decade and a half, due to which we see major advancements, be it in space tech, be it in medicines, be it in pharmaceuticals, everywhere. The Chinese technology is leading the global forefront. We want India to attain the same level so we can learn each other's best practices. We are investing quite heavily and developing in the infrastructure development in India. But China has done that through the 80s, through the 90s and the early 2000s. There also we have a lot of lessons to learn from China. So once we keep on this agenda of learning and mutually gaining from each other, that is when the relationship can always blossom. So moving ahead, one has to keep in mind the key challenges. Both the countries need to address these key challenges, at the same time ensure that there is a progress in the relationship moving ahead. Okay? So in this article, what have we studied? We have studied about the 5 mutuals, that is trust, understanding, respect, accommodation, and accomplishment. Those 5 mutuals need to exist between each other for improvement of relationship. We have studied what are the key challenges confronting Indo-China relationship. At the same time, where do the opportunities lie where this relationship can do something good, not only for each other, but the global order as well. That is more than sufficient what is required for your exam. So let us take a look at the practice question. Discuss the way ahead for the stagnant Indo-China relationship. Now here, the question in itself presumes one reality, and the reality presumed is that Indo-China relationships, they are stagnating, or they are in a stagnant phase. They are not improving, nor are they depreciating significantly. So here, in the introduction, you have to mention or maintain that stance about the stagnant relationship. So when you are writing the introduction, in the introduction, kindly talk about that the relationship between India and China have been in a frosty conditions for the past half a decade owing to border disputes and other different disagreements on the economic front and the strategic sphere. that will be an introduction which will give the evaluator an idea that you have the backdrop of the stagnating relationship. That also provides a flow when you approach the body, and in the body you can talk about the fact that how these Indo-Chinese relationship or this relationship is very vital for the entire global order. Having said that, these relations cannot improve unless and until the sticking points in the relationships are not addressed. What are those sticking points? Address each of them. Talk about them in a point subparagraph manner where you mention a point, underline it, and write a couple of sentences about it. Like that, you can substantiate your answer. Then after that, however, there are significant opportunities for both these countries to work upon so that they can bring about an effective change. And then you talk about the key opportunities. Eventually, while writing the conclusion, talk about the fact that 2.5 billion or almost 3 billion of the global population, if both of them are not on good terms, that is never going to be good for the global order. Together, they represent more than 30% of the global population. And that is why these two countries need to be harmonious with each other in order to ensure that the world is peaceful and the world heeds to the voice of the developing parts of the planet. So like that, you can write the answer. Try writing it yourself and improve the answer writing, get it evaluated. Now, moving on to the second article rather. An unstated shift in Modi's economic direction. Now, while this article has got slight amount of political angle or a political tinge associated with it, our job is to disassociate from any kind of political tinge or any kind of political affluence here. So let us understand and analyze this article threadbare without any aspect of biasness towards any of those opinions. So when we talk about this article, it talks about the fact that, look, in the recent budget, you had the announcement of the employment linked incentive scheme. Now, what is this scheme, by the way? So just to give you a brief idea about the scheme, it aims, now this was announced in the budget this year, it aims to provide 1 crore internships over the next 5 years in 500 top companies with a focus on practical skill development and real world experience. Okay? The scheme will offer eligible candidates a monthly stipend of rupees 5,000 and one-time assistance of rupees 6,000. The companies involved will bear the cost of training, contributing 10% of these costs as part of their CSR or corporate social responsibility. So overall, this is a scheme aimed to promote not only job creation, but at the same time also to promote the skilling of the large labor force. So here, let us understand what this article talks about and what is the genesis of thought process of this article. So this article says that, look, till now the governmental policy which has been followed is very much in the ideology of the Washington Consensus. The Washington Consensus, or the basically what are known as the Bretton Woods firms, now that is the IMF and the World Bank, they believed in the trickle-down effect of the economy. Now, what is this trickle-down effect? It simply says that, let's suppose, if there is in the society, if there is significant amount of capital getting created, that capital will eventually lead to the creation of jobs. Those people will get money. When people who get jobs get money, they will then pass on that money, or they will buy goods from the market, and people in the market will get some money. That will create more jobs, and that is how the entire economy can end up benefiting. So you pay attention as a policy measure, you pay attention at creating those capital goods or the capital assets. Let's suppose you encourage the creation and the expansion of industries that will eventually uplift the entire society. That is the trickle-down effect. This is the policy followed by IMF, World Bank, etc. When they give out loans, when they give out financial assistance, they largely believe in this principle. This principle has got its own drawback, criticism and lacunae, that oftentimes there is accumulation of wealth at the top tier of the society, as a result of which there is growing inequality which significantly becomes apparent in the entire society. So that is the criticism associated. Now the article argues that if you take a look at the policy measures taken or initiated by the government, starting with the Make in India campaign. Now Make in India has been a campaign to improve India's manufacturing prowess, to make India or convert India into a manufacturing hub. So that manufacturing hub would mean more industries would operate, more industries would start to establish themselves, they would keep more people at jobs. So overall, that joblessness condition, which has been a major sticking point for decades now, but then since the population is expanding and significantly expanding, many people, millions of people are entering into workforce year after year. That is when this job creation becomes very, very important. Having said that, this Make in India campaign, as the article argues, while it has slightly improved the manufacturing sector, but has not created the required number of jobs. The industries still after this, they continue to complain to the government that, look, you have initiated the Make in India program, Make in India campaign, but at the same time, your tax levels are so very high for the corporate that it is not conducive for setting up of new industries. So that is when you basically had the government announcing the slash in the corporate tax. Corporate tax cut. Now, it is a different matter altogether that in India, the corporate tax was amongst the highest in the world. So obviously the corporations, the industries, they would always favor those locations where the tax structure is slightly easier or lenient. So keeping that in mind, India slashed its corporate tax levels in order to promote more industrialization. While that boosted again the economy to some extent, but the government's prime role or the prime goal was that once more industries would operate, once more industries would be attracted to India, that is when they would provide more jobs, at the same time improving the economic growth, but also create more jobs. But again, that did not happen so succinctly or to such an apparent level. New jobs created were not significant and quite minimal. Then after that, the government came up with the PLI scheme, that is the production linked scheme, incentive scheme. It allocated a budget linked incentive scheme. Now this was to kickstart the economy and improve the manufacturing growth in the economy post the COVID times, with a whopping budget of close to around 2 lakh crores. The ultimate objective behind the PLI scheme was what? That when the various different organizations would produce more, for that they would require more people. And when they would require more people, they would hire more people. So as more people would be hired, the demand in the economy would grow. Again, other producing areas would improve. Again, more jobs would be created. But the result or the outcome of it is, while few of the companies or significant number of companies, they have availed incentive or subsidies from the government by improving the production level, but they have not generated enough amount of jobs. That is something that this year's economic survey has also focused upon, something that I hope you would have read, or at least you would have heard the gist of the economic survey, where the economic survey significantly talks, and in a very crisp manner, it talks about the fact that, look, while these corporates and the various different corporate houses, they have benefited from the government incentives and the subsidies provided to them, they have not passed those growth into the hands of the employees. That is, the salary figures for the employees are not rising proportionately, and at the same time, when we talk about the other aspects of more job being created and money pushed back into the society, that is not happening. So that ultimate objective is not being fulfilled. That is why Nowadays, you will also find the resonance of the fact, and that has been argued very strongly in the article, that earlier there would be a significant amount of joy or elation within the society whenever the GDP growth numbers would come into the picture. That India has grown at a rate of 8% or 7%, that would create quite a significant amount of jubilation. But nowadays, even when you hear the figure 8.4% growth, 8% growth, hardly it makes any waves within the society. That is because the GDP growth, while it is happening at a tremendous pace, at a fastest pace across anywhere in the world, but at the same time, you still have a lot of unemployment, and at the grassroots, the problem still persists. So society is not finding that to be connecting enough, and that has created mistrust. Now, various different economists, they have basically criticized this ELI scheme, that this direct intervention for job creation will never work. And they talk about reforms, that reforms are needed in the economic setup. We know that in our present setup and in the present parliamentary setup, pushing of reforms is incredibly difficult. So there can be two options. One, wait for the year when everybody will agree that labor reforms need to be carried out. Wait for that particular time when everybody agrees that, okay, reform in, let's suppose, the wage, in the working conditions, that comes up. So that wait can be persistent and forever. So rather than doing that, this ELI scheme is something which can be beneficial, where you can have multiple different things being achieved. First of all, you will have the ability to provide skill level to the people. Now, one of the major problem or the major issues that the industrialists have pointed out for India is the fact that in India, majority of the graduates, they lack the skill level to be employed. So that is why the unemployment numbers are quite high. The survey of the industrialists and the survey also indicated that around 51% of Indian graduates are employable. Rest of them, they don't have any skill level. So once you improve or bring forward this ELI scheme, that will not only generate that job opportunities, but much more importantly, it will create that industry exposure. Many of the time what you have read in your education system in your school days has got absolutely no connect with what is required out there in the real world. So that is why that industry exposure is required. And the expectation is that the companies will also benefit, more hands-on job, and that would improve their economic momentum, economic growth. So it is seen as a win-win situation, but still there will be practical issues. So that is where the implementation of the policy eventually will help us understand where we can improvise. But nonetheless, this particular scheme is something which is touted by the article as a move in the positive or the right direction, because the trickle-down effect which was advocated by the previous policies, that has not created enough jobs. Okay, so in this article, what is it that we have studied? We have basically studied the aspect of the ELI scheme. What is this ELI scheme? We have basically looked at the trickle-down effect. We have then taken a look at the policies indicating the trickle-down effect. So there we have taken a look at that, how Make in India, corporate tax deduction, etc., PLI scheme, all of that were advocating the trickle-down effect. Why the change? Because the jobs were not getting created. Then the overall impact. What will be the impact? More jobs, the companies will benefit, and at the same time, skill levels will improve by the industry exposure. Okay? The practice question. Discuss the relevance of the newly launched employment links incentive scheme in bridging the skill gap in India. Highlight the differences from the previous measures taken. So here, in the introduction, you have to talk about what? You have to talk about this ELI scheme, right? So, or you can have other way to introduce the answer. So, one way of writing the answer is directly talk about the ELI scheme, what are its purposes. The second approach can be that you talk about the fact that how majority of the graduates in India, they are found to be unemployable due to lack of required skill. In order to mitigate that, the government has come up with a ELI scheme to incentivize the industries to take people for internships. The government will bear the cost of it with the ultimate aim to improve the skill level in the population. With improvement of skill level and better exposure, then you talk about how the companies will benefit, how more jobs will be created, and how more people will find some or the other form of employment. Then talk about how is it different from previous scheme. Now please understand one basic difference in writing this answer. Here it talks about the skill gap in India. So you have to focus on that. So when you are talking about the previous measures taken, you also have to highlight about the Skill India program and the Skill India campaigns. While these Skill India campaigns, they were launched with a lot of pomp and show previously, but they did not yield the desired result, because there was always a gap between the institute and the industry in terms of what is taught and what is required. So even after passing through the ITIs and the training institutes, people would still find employment very difficult to be present in the industry. So all of that you highlight, and eventually in the conclusion talk about the fact that India has a very large youthful population. Unless and until significant amount of jobs are not created, we are staring at a situation of a demographic disaster, which is never good for any economy or any society. For that, we need to create more jobs, and ELI scheme is rightfully so a decision in the right direction. Okay, like that you can write the answer. Then, the weakest first. This basically is about the recent Supreme Court judgment, where it allowed for a greater representation or the reservation within the subcaste of the Supreme Court, subcaste of the scheduled caste. Now, what the Supreme Court argued in this entire judgment was or is something that can be understood very crisply in 3 to 4 points. First of all, the argument, and this judgment, by the way, has been given by the majority bench, where you had the 6-to-1 ratio of this judgment. That is, 6 of the judges agreed in favor, 1 was the dissenting judgment. So here, amongst the arguments made, what were the arguments made by the Supreme Court judges? One is that the scheduled castes cannot be treated as a monolith. Treated as a monolith means what? It basically means that the entire scheduled caste cannot be considered as homogeneous or similar. Within that also you have various different caste divide. The concept of it is very simple. Let's suppose within the scheduled castes which are basically notified, and the notification is released, and as per the constitution also you have the members of the scheduled caste. Now within them you have various different subcaste. Now the Supreme Court had earlier in its judgment in Chennaiya versus Andhra Pradesh in 2004 had talked about the fact and had been very dismissive of the fact that the state government cannot provide reservation or separate reservation to some of the subcastes. Right. But this time the Supreme Court has said that, look, all the subcastes within the scheduled caste, they cannot be thought to have the same status. Some of them could develop more, some of them could have traveled further more in terms of the social economic empowerment, while others might be still very backward. So that is why, in order to ensure and propagate a kind of a homogeneous growth of the society, those of them who have not benefited from the aspect of reservation, they can be provided a greater chunk of reservation within that. What does it surmount to exactly? Let's suppose the scheduled caste overall, let's assume, I'm just giving an assumption, let's assume they are given a reservation of X%. Right? Let's suppose X%. Now, how that X% will be divided between the subcaste 1, 2, 3, 4 and 5, that is the judgment. That rather than all of them enjoying equal amount of reservation, there can be different amount of reservation provided for, let's suppose, the subcaste 4, or less reservation provided to subcaste 1, depending upon which of the subcaste has gone through that developmental ladder. Now, that is one of the aspects. Now, this is seen to be, in a way, further cementing the affirmative action and improving the affirmative action vertically as well as horizontally. In affirmative action, first of all, immediately after the implementation of the Constitution and the implementation of the reservation policy, the thought process was that, look, when we talk about the deprived classes of the society, first of all, no discrimination should be carried out, and in order to provide them a level playing field, they should be provided some amount of reservation. That was the thought process. Now, after that, once we talk about the subcaste within them, it is also a reality that all of them have not developed. While in some of the subcasts you will find that there has been a significant benefit in terms of employment, large number of people from certain subcaste represented in the grade A jobs, the grade 1 jobs, but at the same time, other subcastes not getting the benefit of that amount of reservation because historically they have been further more marginalized. So as the scheduled caste cannot be treated as a monolith. Then other than that, historical deprivations or backwardness to be kept in mind. To be kept in mind. Then one intriguing factor which can in a way trigger a lot of controversy. Now, Supreme Court order is not binding, but eventually Supreme Court order can also have the potential to create some amount of mistrust because someone will infer it in a different manner and they will give their interpretation. And in the present day age of social media, you never know which interpretation flies in the public. So that is why there can be a significant scope of mistrust. But what Supreme Court has argued that, look, just like how you have the creamy layer concept in the OBC, similarly, there needs to be a creamy layer concept, need for creamy layer concept within the SCs as well. Concept in SCs. What does that mean? That basically means that once you talk about, let's suppose, an individual of the SC community who has, let's suppose, become an IAS officer. Now, that individual is married to someone from the same caste who is also an IAS officer. Now, both of them, they belong to the scheduled caste. So, their kids, should they have the reservation provided? In all fairness, the Constitution says that they have to be. But when you think about it, then all the other arguments tell you that their kid will have a better social upbringing, better educational economic condition. So reservation should not be provided to them. But here is where the contradiction lies within the Supreme Court judgment itself. So Supreme Court has said that historical deprivations are to be kept in mind. Now, once you keep that historical deprivation in mind, now then you cannot separate any individual from the aspect or the ambit of reservation that they are doing well economically right now. Right? Historical deprivation and that impact on mindset, that is something which will always be challenged in the court. So, that is where the Supreme Court judgment is about including various different subcastes, improving their impact or improving their share in the overall aspect of reservation. Now, what will be its impact? The impact can be divided into both positive and negative. First of all, let us take a look at the positive. So, the positive impact which can be created is the fact that many ignored subcastes, right, even within the scheduled caste community, who don't have enough rights, who don't have enough representation, who are marginalized despite the fact that reservation in the country has existed for such a long time, despite the fact that affirmative action is actively pursued as a government policy at the state and the central level as well. Despite the fact all the ignored sections of the subcaste, they will find a representation. So there will be better representation. Better representation. Secondly, overall upliftment of marginalized sections of marginal population or marginalized population, right? Then eventually, let's suppose, even though it is highly unlikely, absolutely unlikely that any government in their right frame of mind will be able to implement or will even try to implement that aspect of creamy layer within the scheduled caste. Even if any government tries to implement it, even then it won't stand the jurisdictional examination, because the historical backwardness and the historical oppression is something which will be kept in mind as per the Constitution, as per the Supreme Court judgment as well. So that is why there, even if let's suppose that creamy layer concept is implemented, that would mean the people who rightfully deserve the reservation, they get the reservation, rather than those who get the reservation despite upliftment of that section of the society. But at the same time, there can be some negatives which one has to be wary about. And that is the politicization of reservation. In the sense, various different political parties at the state level, let's suppose they have their own individual vote banks. Now, those vote banks belong to a certain community. Now, if let's suppose they want to nurture another vote bank, they can promise them reservation. Now, that is a very great pull in terms of the vote bank politics. So it can lead to a very vicious vote bank competitive politics from one state to another. So the impact can be devastating. Various different state governments, anyways, you would see that they keep on passing these laws primarily before the elections in order to gather much more amount of vote. So that is where you can have vote bank politics inculcated. Okay? So that is basically the entire aspect or the analysis of this judgment. Overall, this judgment is one of those which will deepen the aspect of affirmative action, make it more penetrative to the grassroots, to the people who actually require it. But at the same time, there are various challenges which confront us along with that. Okay? Now, after that, moving on to the next article. The next article talks about the death reigns on Wayanad. Now, what has been unfolding in Wayanad has been nothing short of a disaster. Now, there were significant amount of landslides and the death toll is rising. The number of people missing are still significant in the terms of hundreds. More than 200 people have been claimed by these landslides, and in very awful and woeful situations, villages have been wiped out. So that brings to question a larger aspect, that is why these landslides and such disasters are becoming very common. In today's newspaper itself, I have not included those articles because all of them indicate the same thing. You have landslides in Himachal, significant number of casualties. Landslides in Uttarakhand, significant number of casualties. West Bengal, landslides are happening. Kerala, landslides are happening. So landslides are happening across the country. And it raises a very vital concern about our balance with the society or balance with the nature, and how our relentless and unsustainable pursuit of economic progress and construction activities has put the nature at risk, eventually leading to us being at risk. So in the region of Wayanad, Wayanad is one of the very vulnerable areas when it comes to landslides. If you take a look at overall landslides in India, almost over the past few years, almost 60% of the thousands of landslides which have occurred across the country, almost 60% of that landslide has occurred in the region of Kerala. And Kerala has been experiencing large amount of these landslides, floods, claiming lot of lives. So this is a point of concern. Now, first of all, why do landslides occur in the region of these Western Ghats? Why landslides occur in Western Ghats? So here, let us take a look at the points. The first point is basically excessive concentrated rainfall. Excessive concentrated rains. What do we mean by excessive concentrated rains? First of all, not only is the rainfall quite significant in the region of the Western Ghats. Why is it very significant? Because Western Ghats are what we refer to as an escarpment, right? Escarpment. That means Western Ghats have a topography somewhat like this. So the moist winds which come here, they are forced to rise up almost vertically, creating a very huge development of cloud cover, and that causes intense amount of rainfall concentrated in region. But also due to climate change, what is happening is that the normal distribution of rainfall is getting impacted, in the sense that, let's suppose when you talk about the normal day rains, or before or prior to the condition when the climate change became very apparent, you had distributed rainfall. Even if you remember your childhood days, you would have experienced that after the monsoon season, let's suppose 2 centimeter of rainfall, maybe on a daily basis, or every 3 days 2 centimeter of rainfall. So the ground also had enough time to absorb that and digest that. The rivers would also be able to drain that. But now what you have is 10 days of very dry condition, 11th day 10 centimeter, 15 centimeter of rains in one day, 20 centimeter of rains in one day, followed by another spell of dry condition. So what you have is that extremely concentrated amount of rainfall in one day, the ground won't be able to digest. That leads to landslides, that leads to floods, etc. Then other than that, construction and settlements in eco-sensitive areas. Settlements in eco-sensitive zones. Okay. In the vulnerable areas of Western Ghats, particularly if we talk about the region of Kerala itself, around the region of Mukurthi protected area, around the region of Wayanad, around the region of Sultan Baitri, in all those areas, you have very vulnerable landscape, and the population is also huge. At the same time, the resort tourism and the resort construction is happening at a wanton pace. Various areas in the region of the Western Ghats, you will find that right at the hill slopes, various different resorts, and once the resorts come out, the associated settlements and habitations also come up. So that basically weakens the slope. And once the slope weakens, then the entire region, the slope, is prone to landslide. Even the landslide which has occurred in Wayanad is nothing but a reactivation of the previous landslide zone. So these are already the zones which are prone to landslides. There also construction and settlements are happening. Then also the reason for the obstruction or the further exaggeration of the disaster is blockage of river channels. How? By encroachment. So let's suppose this is the traditional floodplain of a river. Now what you have done, that is what we have done, we have basically constructed habitations in the floodplains. So the river has got a very narrow path available for itself to flow. So in case of excess amount of flow water, all these habitations immediately get drowned, and then it becomes a path for the landslides to occur. Then other than that, you have monoculture practices, deforestation done for construction, at the same time plantation agriculture. Plantation agriculture, that is coffee estates, tea estates. Rather than having a natural vegetation to thrive in this area, which will also be beneficial for the biodiversity, in all these areas, you will find increased amount of plantation crops. Plantation crops in the sense of, let's suppose, when we talk about tea, coffee, etc. Now that represents monoculture, that in the entire area you have just planted tea or coffee. Now tea and coffee plants, regardless of the economic benefits associated, at the same time you have to understand that they won't have the roots penetrating to the depth of the soil. So they won't be able to hold the soil in its own place. As a consequence, excess rainfall, the soil simply drains off. So these are some of the major factors associated, right? Now, simultaneously, you also have a lot of landslides in the region of the Himalayas, right? So the reasons for the landslides here. Before that, a very brief understanding of what actually happened in Wayanad. So in Wayanad, if you have to understand the basics of it, you consider the hilly regions, right? And through these hilly regions, let's suppose there was a river, its tributary also draining into this. Right? Now what actually happened? Due to excessive rainfall, the rainfall became quite heavy, and this excessively heavy rainfall is again a byproduct of the conditions of climate change. Now because of that, you had an older landslide zone which was activated across the tributary of the Cheliyar River. Now that significantly increased the flow in the tributary of the Cheliyar River. That increased flow meant that the Cheliyar River also had increased amount of water. That saturated the soil in the region, and there was a slippage of more than 50,000 square meters of soil from the region of the hills. All that started draining down. Now the river, if let's suppose it would have been left undisturbed, then the problem would not have been so magnified. But then this river had been encroached upon, and you had dense habitations all around. Even across one of the older channels of the river, which the river had abandoned long time back. But at the same time, you had encroachments. Encroachments mean there would be deposition, pollution on the riverbed also. So the river channel won't have that capacity to flow. Eventually what happened, as the river did not find enough space for that excess flow and excess sediments, it reactivated its older channel. It started flowing through its older channel. As it flowed through the older channel, all the villages and the habitations which lied in the way, they were swept away. And that is why the disaster is so significant. It is almost the behavior indicated by River Kosi. River Kosi also causes very damaging floods in terms of casualties, loss of life and property. That is because it changes the course and it goes to its older channel. This time this happened with River Cheliyar as well. So that is why the devastation is of such high magnitude. But Wayanad keeps on experiencing these landslides. It is not the first time. So that begs the question that should we not have taken some precautionary measures in the area? Should we not have gone for slope stabilization in the region? Should we not have gone for the hazard zonation, that this is a region which is prone to hazards, so we can evacuate or relocate the people? So these are the questions on the administrative front. But simultaneously, we also have landslides in the region of the Himalayas. Now, in the region of Himalayas, the reasons are quite different. Well, many of these, they come into the realm of the subject of geography and in the portion of optional. So that is where you will cover it in much greater detail. So, but otherwise, just a basic preview of it. In the Himalayas, Himalayas are a seismic zone, very prone to earthquakes. So slightest shaking of the slope will lead to the landslides. Also, you have the evolving slope. The height of the Himalayas are still increasing. The slope is not stable. As a consequence, you still have a lot of loose soil moving around. Then the presence of sedimentary rocks, particularly in the lower reaches, sedimentary rocks in the lower folds of the Himalayas, that is in the region of the Himachal and the region of the Shivaliks. Now these sedimentary rocks easily get saturated, and as a consequence they tend to slip, and that is why these landslides are very common. Then you have again unsustainable tourism, construction leading to slope weakening. Then after that you have another factor, and that is hogback topography of Himalayas. In simple terms, what do we mean by hogback topography? Now Himalayas, as they are being formed, it is the Indian plate which is pushing into the Eurasian landmass, leading to the formation of Himalayas. So that is why the Himalayas have a kind of a condition where the southern slope is much steeper and the northern slope is gentle. As a consequence of that steep slope, the monsoon or the moist winds, they rise up vertically, leading to clouds, very dense cloud formation, which can lead to cloudburst as well. So hogback topography, then presence of a lot of cloudbursts, then deforestation, again for resort tourism, deforestation. Mining is also something which is very prevalent in the region of the Himalayas, particularly in the northeastern stretches. Mining activities can be dangerous. Increased population pressure is already there. Population pressure. So these are some of the factors why Himalayas experience annual landslides, and the factors due to which Western Ghats experience landslides. So because of this, there are significantly heavy casualties on both the regions of the country, and that is where we need to go for the eco-sensitive zonation of these areas, so that we can limit the construction, we respect the nature as it is, and those vulnerable areas don't have habitations, so that vital life and property can be protected. Okay. Now, UPSC has asked questions from this previously in GS paper 1. While detailed study and analysis of the slips, landslides, very much in the portion of the geography optional, where UPSC repeats a question from this optional, repeats a question from this topic in the optional almost every year. So that is where, if you are interested in geography optional, we have launched a course in English language, in English medium for the portion of optional. Do avail that optional course. You can use the code MJOPT and avail maximum discount. In the meanwhile, let us take a look at the previous year question here. Differentiate the causes of the landslides in the Himalayan region and the Western Ghats. This was a question of 2021. In this, you basically had to talk about the topography of the Himalayas, the topography of the Western Ghat, increased cloudburst events in this region as well. Then how can the mountain ecosystem be restored from the negative impact of developmental initiatives and tourism? Both these questions, they talk about the criticality of the mountainous ecosystem and the damage that they are causing to the biodiversity, at the same time the human loss of life and property. So here you have to address the reasons for that and talk about environmental impact assessment to be carried out before any construction activities are taken into place. Then regulatory mechanisms need to be further strengthened about the hazard zonation, early warning systems. There needs to be a particular standard operating procedure in place in order to prevent the damages. Otherwise, you always have the case where the warning departments, they tell you that the warning had been issued. The state governments tell you that no warning has been received. So a proper standard operating procedure needs to be established. We have seen events or disasters like Kedarnath, etc. unfolding in front of our own eyes, claiming thousands of lives, tens of thousands of lives. We cannot let this event keep on continuing despite the fact that technology has been advancing. High time to put a cap to it and that is how you conclude the answer. Okay? Now, a related topic, a very related aspect, that is Center reissues draft notification on the eco-sensitive areas in Western Ghats. Now, Center, through its draft notification, which is open for public intervention and the public opinion as well. Now, this draft notification has basically delineated some areas across all the 6 states where the Western Ghats passes through, where you will have, or the eco-sensitive regions lie, in the sense where the environment or ecology is particularly fragile. So here, which are the 6 states, by the way? In 2017 in Prelims, UPSC had asked a question in the Prelims about the eco-sense or the extent of the Western Ghats. In which states do the Western Ghats lie? So starting from Gujarat, Maharashtra, Goa, Karnataka, Kerala and Tamil Nadu. This is the extent of the Western Ghats. Now, these are the zones of critical habitat where you have a very sensitive slope and dense vegetation as well. Earlier, sufficient or significant amount of mining would be carried out, exploitation of the timber resources would be carried out, due to which a lot of biodiversity has been lost in the area. Now, after that, you basically had a committee, a standing committee which was set up under the chairmanship of an ecologist, that is Madhav Gadgil, what was known as the Gadgil Committee. Now, Madhav Gadgil basically was of the opinion, and the committee basically opined, that the entire region of Western Ghats should be declared as eco-sensitive area. The economic activities should not happen, habitations should not come to these eco-sensitive areas, and also mining, etc., other activities should come to a stop. Now, as per this committee, you had basically the entire zone spanning around 129,000 square kilometer of area to be declared as eco-sensitive zone. Now, this immediately elicited a lot of protests by all the state governments that we cannot declare the entire region. What will happen to the economy? What will happen to the habitations? That is where, after some time, the government set up another standing committee, that is the Kasturi Rangan. The Kasturi Rangan Committee the previous chairman of ISRO. So that Kasturi Rangan Committee, basically half the area, they decided to half the area where you decide or declare this region as eco-sensitive zone. Now, it is a sheer coincidence that even though this draft notification was issued almost 15 to 20 days back, you still have the case where regions such as Wayanad, Sultan Betri, etc. in Kerala are mentioned, that these should be declared as eco-sensitive area. Resort tourism, etc. should be restricted. Now, immediately the Kerala government also had protested. Why? And there are still protests against this draft notification by the state government. Because Kerala is in news, so the argument from the side of the Kerala state has been that, look, we have a very high population density. And if we declare these regions of Western Ghats as eco-sensitive, where will the population go to? And the economic activities will come to a complete standstill. Tourism is one of the major revenue earners. So what do we do for that? So that is why there have been various different repeated protests. A new standing committee has been set up in order to look at the grievances by the states and remove those grievances or get rid of those grievances as well. So that is the aspect of this draft notification. It has been issued, and then right now the states are basically raising their objections, and eventually once a consensus is reached, then those places across the region of the Western Ghats will be declared as eco-sensitive zones where further developmental aspect should not be permitted in an unsustainable way. Okay? Now, coming to another article, that is India faces dilemma amid rising Iran-Israel tensions over Ismail Haniyeh's killing. Now, Ismail Haniyeh, who was an important dignitary or an important member of the Hamas, now he has been assassinated in Iran, all of you must be aware. Now, details have basically started pouring out where it has been indicated that this assassination was planned months in advance, where the explosive device was actually planted in the hotel many months before. And once the security or the intelligence agencies came to know that Haniyeh is staying in that room, that is when it was detonated. Now, this has sparked a lot of tension. While Iran has taken it significantly upon its chin as a kind of an intruding action by Israel, Israel seeks it as a kind of a natural justice for the October 7 massacre by Hamas. Now, various different countries have reacted differently. Today morning, you had the news where the US has deployed its additional forces in the region of Middle East because it is expecting Iran's retaliation to Israel. Right? You have USS Abraham Lincoln, the aircraft carrier USS Abraham Lincoln, which has been stationed in the region of Middle East. The US European Command, including the strike force by the fighter squadron, has been placed in the region of the Middle East. They are anticipating a reply or an attack by Iran. Now, Air India had also yesterday announced the suspension of flights to Tel Aviv, because it is also, the entire world is expecting the Iran-Israel clash to escalate. Now, India has been caught in a kind of a dilemma here, because all this happened at the time of the inauguration ceremony of the new Iranian president, that is Masoud Pezeshkian. Now, Masoud Pezeshkian, who is the new president of Iran, who is supposed to be the new president of Iran. Now, it was in his inauguration ceremony where in this image, you will observe the Indian representative in the form of our Minister for Road Transport and Highways, Mr. Nitin Gadkari. He was also a part of that inauguration. Now, in this manner, India had showed its tacit support to the Iranian administration in the sense that we are with you, because India has got ties with Iran. Economic ties, cultural ties, people-to-people connect, and India is seeking to develop multiple different economic parameters with Iran in the sense of when we talk about the development of the Chabahar port. That is one of those, right? Chabahar port. Now, that is very important for India. It seeks to establish an alternative from the Gwadar port. Then, other than that, the international north-south transportation corridor, where India is seeking to establish a trade route from the region of Central Asia and Russia all the way passing through Iran, right? Then even when we talk about India, Middle East, European corridor, that can never be a success unless and until Iran is an agreeing player. So, Indian and Indo-Iranian relationships are something that New Delhi has always kept at a very important pedestal. That is why Nitin Gadkari was sent to be a part of the inauguration ceremony of Pezeshkian. Now, at the same time, Indo-Israeli relationships are also very critical. Again, people-to-people contact. Again, when we talk about critical defense technology, right now, intrusion from Pakistan is at a very significant rate in the region of the Jammu Kashmir sector. So that would mean, again, critical equipments, technology for smart fencing, etc. All of that, the demand would be very high. So due to that, Indo-Israeli relationship is also very important. Now, Indo-Israeli relationship is important, and Israel has basically been nudging India to improve that relationship. And Indo-Iranian relationship is also important. India has basically managed to send construction workers to Israel and also caregivers to Israel in large numbers in the tune of thousands in order to replace the older Palestinian workers who had been sacked by Israel. While India has not relegated or designated Hamas as a terrorist organization, but still, India is not receptive to their recent actions. India seeks itself as a kind of a dialogue seeker, as a kind of a resolution seeker. But this Iran-Israel conflict has got the potential again to put India into a corner where it might be forced to take on or choose or pick a side. But our experience in the case of Russia-Ukraine conflict indicates that we will be able to navigate these tough waters. That is our diplomatic heft. But till then, there are significant amount of push and pull in the regions of Middle East that India has to be careful about, because it can have its implications in the future. If, let's suppose, Indo-Iranian relationships, they go sour, then eventually it will be dangerous on our western frontiers. Okay. Now, after that, moving to a couple of articles relevant for your prelims. So here, India selects 2 crew members for Axiom 4 missions to International Space Station. Now, the crew members that India had been training for the Gaganyaan mission, they will be sent to International Space Station as per a mission of the part of the Axiom missions. Axiom missions, they are a private mission whereby basically you have the training programs, the research modules, etc., which are worked upon. So here, Indo-US agreement, when you had the Prime Minister's visit to US, at that point of time, you had an Indo-US agreement in terms of the training of these astronauts from India. And that is where it was agreed upon the fact that India would send its astronauts aboard the US vessels to the International Space Station so that they can gain the vital experience which will come in handy at the time of the Gaganyaan mission. So there has been an agreement between ISRO and NASA, right, as per which there is the private service provider, that is the Axiom Space Inc. in US, which sends missions to the International Space Station, and 2 of these Gaganyatris, or the Indian astronauts, they have been chosen for the mission. Okay. Now, then the last article of the day, elevated broad-based food inflation to force RBI to hold. This is about the monetary policy rate. Now, we know that owing to high amount of rainfall and disruptions in transportation corridors, food inflation is going to be a sticking point. Food inflation in the coming months, or in the coming weeks rather, almost up till a month, food inflation is going to be high because of farm losses due to excessive rainfall. At the same time, logistics cost would increase because of transportation disruptions. So keeping that in mind, the general public consensus is that RBI will hold steady in terms of the policy rates. Policy rates as in the repo rate, the bank rates, etc. Now here, the policy rates, if let's suppose the RBI lowers the policy rate, what happens in that case? When the policy rate is lowered, very briefly we'll take a look into this relationship. So immediately what happens? Borrowings improve, or the borrowings increase by the various financial institutions, by the banks, etc. The borrowings increase because now the rate of interest has been lowered. Once the borrowings have increased, that would mean what? That would mean that the money supply in the market, in the economy, would increase. That means people will have more expendable income, more disposable income. When people have more disposable income, that is when demand will significantly increase. But at a time when you have food inflation, at a time when you have the supply constraint, this demand can lead to a further rise in inflation. So in order to control that is why policy rate is not lowered. Policy rate is kept stable. In order to reduce the inflation, you increase the amount of rates that you charge. So that is why, in order to find the perfect balance, the consensus is that the RBI policy rates will be kept stable in the next policy review meeting. Okay. So that basically brings us to the end of the discussion for today's Hindu newspaper. We have covered the various different articles, tried to interrelate some of the articles with each other, and in a very crisp manner, we have managed to discuss only those portions which will be useful and vitally important for you to write the answers in the examination. I hope that this session has been helpful to you and has added some amount of value to your existing knowledge set. If you have liked the session, put that in the comment section below. Don't forget to click on the like, share and the subscribe button. And the most important aspect, we talk about one of the issues, what has led to the various different accidents and landslides in the eco-sensitive areas. In the comment section below, write about what is your solution. What do you think a solution out of the box which can be utilized in order to reduce these accidents and these natural disasters? Put that in the comment section below. And till we meet again, take care of yourself. Goodbye. Thank you.